Hi, welcome to the POMEPS Conversations. I'm Marc, Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies, George Washington University, and the Project on Middle East Political Science. With me today, we have Wendy Pearlman of Northwestern University and the author of Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, out last year with Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you.
So, Wendy, you just came back from Jordan, where you were talking with Syrian refugees.
Right.
Can you tell us just a little bit about what you found there? What were your impressions?
Well, it was a fascinating experience, and I'm still making sense of it. So I don't have a full sense yet of what I found and what I haven't found, but I learned a tremendous amount. So I was in Jordan for 5 weeks, from mid-September until late October. I've just been back for about 3 weeks, speaking with Syrians there in Jordan about how the uprising first began in Syria, what their experience was, where they were when protests began, what they thought, what they felt, and what their own sort of personal narrative of the uprising as they lived it and as they experienced it. So given the population in Jordan, I'm well aware that I was not speaking with a representative example of all of Syrian society or the Syrian uprising. Most of the people I was speaking with are from Daraa province, the province in southern Syria where the uprising in Syria began and where the bulk of refugees in Jordan are from, because they're right over the border with Jordan, but as well a good portion of people from Homs and other places. So I did interviews with about 60 Syrians, varying lengths, these interviews. And
you said they weren't all in the refugee camps.
Right. So the Zaatari refugee camp was established in Jordan in the summer of 2012. So the first waves of Syrians coming into Jordan were basically, are still living in apartments and houses, some of them living with family, if they had family on the Jordanian side of the border, or people who were renting apartments and trying to keep life as normal as possible, rather than congregating all refugees living in a camp where they would be more identifiable and exposed and have lives be less normal than they would be if they were living in towns. And it was only when the Syrian refugee crisis got so big and there were so many refugees, and especially last summer when 500, 1,000 people were arriving every single day in Jordan, that the kingdom established a refugee camp. And now there are plans in the works already to make a second refugee camp. So the Zaatari refugee camp in the north of Jordan has, last I've heard, about 40,000 people. And there are plans for a second camp, but there are several times that number. The estimates of maybe 200,000 refugees, at least maybe 250,000 refugees total, means that many more times than people in the camp are living scattered around the country. So I made 6 or 7 trips to the camp where I was talking to people in Zaatari, and otherwise was talking to refugees scattered all over Jordan.
Now, what did you hear that surprised you? Anything which goes against conventional narratives about the crisis?
So there were lots of interesting things. I think one thing that surprised me the most was how surprised Syrians were themselves with how this began and how it continued. So there is the legend of Daraa and how the uprising began in Daraa, with these stories of how anti-regime graffiti appeared on a wall of a school, and security forces came to the school, arrested several children, although they had no evidence of who it was who wrote that graffiti. Families went to ask for the release of the children. They were insulted by the chief of police. People went out into protest calling for freedom and dignity and wanting the release of these children, and then people were killed and things escalated from there. But over and over again, people from Daraa would tell me, when this began, we had they weren't even demands. It was calling for freedom and for dignity. People did not expect it to escalate and be a revolution. They did not go out immediately calling for the overthrow of the regime. They did not expect such violence. People would say to me things like, we thought this would end in a week or 2 weeks. And also people would say that they expected a much different reaction from the president, from Bashar al-Assad. That people would say things like, we loved Bashar. We thought that he would come out and grant us a little bit of reform, and people would say, if he made a little bit of reform during those days, we would have made him king. That they were surprised by the violence. They were surprised by the intransigence of the regime. They were surprised by that first speech from Bashar al-Assad when he gave to parliament, and he laughed and he dismissed the protests as being foreign conspirators and terrorist gangs, that people were shocked by that reaction. They did not expect it to escalate, they did not expect it to become so violent. They never expected it to arrive at the state it's arrived at today. And I think that's something that I may have read from my readings on Syria, but did not know the degree to which it was across the board from everyone I talked to, and how stunned they were themselves by how this has unfolded.
Did people seem to have any idea about how this might end?
No, and people would often ask me, how do you think it's going to end? And it's funny because I was there before the U.S. elections, and people would often ask me about the U.S. policy, and they seemed very much aware, saying that the Syrian situation is in the freezer until you Americans get through your stupid election already, and we can't wait for you to get over election season so you can go back to taking foreign policy seriously. And I said, can't imagine how much you have in common with the American populace and just wanting the election to happen already and have us all move on. But people seemed, it's funny, I would talk to some people who said, we wake up every day thinking maybe today the regime will collapse, and other people thinking that this may be 5 or 10 years. And it's difficult, the experience of refugees, because everyone just was hoping to pack their bags and go back to Syria the next day. And when I was saying goodbye to people in late October, thinking, well, maybe I'll come back next summer, and I would be sure to say to people, goodbye, I hope to come back and see you, but I hope I come back to Jordan and not find a single one of you people here. And people would say, inshallah, we don't want to be here either. And people would give me their addresses of how I could find them in Syria if next time I come back they'll already be home. And this is, of course, the heartbreaking nature of it. I remember an old woman in the camp giving me her address from how I could get from Damascus to her village, which doesn't really exist anymore in the form of it. So people, I think don't know. But there's certainly that sense of impermanence among the refugees in Jordan. I have someone else I talked to, and at the end of the interview asked for his phone number in Jordan, and he said, I don't have my phone number memorized, let me look it up. And I said to him, how long have you been in Jordan? And he said, 1 year and 7 months. And you could say at that point it's a deliberate choice not to memorize the number, and we're just on the cusp of going back to Syria. I don't even want to acknowledge that I haven't been there as long as I have.
Now, let me ask you, one of the things which has clearly changed about Syria is it starts off as a peaceful protest movement. Then you have this long kind of uneasy interaction between the protest movement and the armed opposition. Now it's gone largely in the direction of an armed opposition, but there's still many people committed to peaceful protest. But the balance between them has clearly shifted over time. Now, you're the author of a book on violence, nonviolent strategies in the Palestinian case. Does what's happened in Syria, does it fit the lessons that you drew from Palestine, or is something different going on?
That's a great question. I mean, there's certainly not the exact replica of the dynamics, but I think certain dynamics work as well. In the book, I argue on the Palestinian case. Well, the question is under what conditions a national liberation movement, a self-determination movement, or in this case, an anti-regime struggle, uses violent or non-violent protest strategies. And I argue that there are many factors shape the use of violence or non-violence, but one factor is the degree of internal cohesion in a movement itself. And in the Palestinian case, we can see that when the movement was more fragmented, there was a greater likelihood of using violence, that internal divisions itself create impetuses to use violence. Factions use violence as a way of competing against each other. There is space for external groups to intervene with their own agendas and use different cells and factions in a way encouraging use of violence, offering resources and motivations for violence that are stronger than they would be otherwise. And that if a movement wants to use and sustain nonviolent protest on a mass scale, they need to be internally cohesive.
And we know the Syrian opposition has always struggled with its internal unity.
Cohesion, absolutely. So there is clearly the question of how regime repression escalates, radicalizes, and creates a response among protesters is a huge issue, and the internal cohesion is something that doesn't that is a different factor at work. And in emphasizing internal cohesion, I don't want to de-emphasize the role of brute repression and radicalizing forces. But clearly the issue of internal unity in the Syrian opposition or the Syrian movement, if there even is a single Syrian opposition, has been an issue from the start. And it's not mysterious why it would be the case after some 4 decades of crushing civil society that Syrian society would create the internal institutional means of creating a movement is really a heroic task. And it's remarkable the degree that Syrian communities did create committees that communities were able to organize themselves. One thing I kept hearing from Syrians was the degree of self-help on the local level that went into creating protests. How people took the initiative to give food to people who didn't have food, or a village would come to the aid of another village when it was under siege, or people would take the initiative to film protests and send the film to Syrian migrants overseas, would then upload it when people weren't able to upload it themselves. So there's a tremendous amount of self-help and personal initiative that was going on, that without it, the Syrian uprising might not have lasted as long as it did. But in terms of a single political structure to unify protests in different localities, to give it a political set of spokespeople that can identify clear goals, that can answer the questions that the international community and people within Syria have about what's coming next, that kind of internal cohesion has been missing. So that has been, I think, difficult in moving the nonviolence and keeping nonviolence as a prominent force. And then the issue of within the cracks of an opposition movement, how other external actors intervene with their own ideologies and their own agendas is something that we're absolutely seeing with this fear that everyone keeps talking about, the extremist tendencies in jihadi groups and Salafi groups and Islamist groups with Saudi funding and with Qatari funding, and Syrian rebellion feeling like it's been abandoned by the West and desperate for arms, desperate for money, desperate for support, getting it from whatever quarters it's offered, and all of that dramatically complexifying what began as a more simple opposition for dignity and freedom. So clearly there's a relationship between how a movement is internally divided, that offering opportunities for external intervention, which further that fragmentation. There's that kind of feedback loop. Fragmentation enables external intervention, which further creates fragmentation. How all of that is rolled back is a real challenge, but all of that facilitates violent protest in a way it does not nonviolent protest.
That's interesting. And so in Doha, they've come together and formed this new umbrella political organization. Right. Is that the sort of thing which can break that cycle, or do you think it's too far gone at this point in terms of fragmentation and these groups with their own agendas and sources of revenues and arms? Is it too late?
I don't know if there's ever a point where it's too late, and I wouldn't want to say too late, because I think at that point you say then nothing can be done, you throw up your hands and you say, we'll just sit back and watch this country implode, self-destruct, and tear itself about further. That to say too late means that there should be a ceasing of looking for initiatives, and there should never be attempts to do whatever possible to save lives and bring an end to this conflict, and hopefully bring an end that creates a more democratic, free, safe Syria for all Syrians. So I think it is a step in the right direction, but there's no doubt that the task is monumental ahead. What needs to be done. But I think that definitely there is that the international community's response and the U.S. I think response is correct in thinking that part of a solution or part of aiding what the Syrian rebellion itself is fighting for is trying to facilitate this unity. No, I don't think that necessarily the idea that cohesion is a prerequisite for A, B, and C, and that the U.S. and the international community in that sense sets its demands upon the Syrian opposition, or makes you guys need to behave in this and this way before we will help this humanitarian crisis and this rebellion against authoritarianism. But cohesion is something that I think Syrians themselves want, and is part of what will allow the rebellion to be successful.
All right. Well, thank you, Wendy. Wendy Pearlman, the author of Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, and a professor at Northwestern University. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks.